My sister Victoria thought she was so clever when she stole my dream wedding venue deposit, but what she didn't know was that her betrayal would lead me to discover a web of family lies so deep that by the time I was done, I wouldn't just get my wedding back, I'd own every resort she could ever dream of having. My name is Claire Hamilton, and this is the story of how my sister's greed gave me the keys to an empire she never saw coming. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The morning light filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Aspen Ridge Resort as I stood in what was supposed to be my wedding venue, watching my sister Victoria adjust her veil in the exact spot where I had envisioned saying my vows to Nathan just 2 months earlier. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was here as a guest at my own dream wedding, watching someone else live out the vision I had spent 18 months planning down to the last detail. Victoria looked radiant, I had to admit, standing therein. Her flowing ivory gown with the Rocky Mountains serving as her backdrop. The same backdrop I had fallen in love with during my first site visit, when the wedding coordinator Margaret had walked me through the rose garden and pointed out how the afternoon sun would cast the perfect golden glow during the ceremony. The same garden where Nathan had proposed to me 3 years ago during a weekend getaway, getting down on one knee beside the fountain that now held Victoria's elaborate floral arrangements instead of my simple white roses. The guests were arriving in expensive cars, their doors slamming shut with the solid thunk that only comes from vehicles worth more than most people's annual salaries. I recognized most of the faces from countless Hamilton family gatherings over the years. Business associates of my father's development company, board members from my mother's various charitable committees, and the usual collection of Denver's social elite who never missed an opportunity to see and be seen at the event of the season. I adjusted the silver bracelet on my wrist, a nervous habit I'd developed over the past few months, and tried to ignore the way people's eyes lingered on me for just a moment too long before they looked away. They all knew. The entire social circle of Cherry Hills Village and downtown Denver knew that this was supposed to be my wedding, that somehow my younger sister had managed to swoop in and claim not just my venue but my entire wedding date. What they didn't know was how she had managed to pull it off, and honestly, neither did I. Not yet, anyway. Nathan squeezed my hand as we found our seats in the third row, behind my parents and Victoria's soon-to-be in-laws. His touch was meant to be comforting, but I could feel the tension in his fingers. He was struggling with this situation almost as much as I was, though for different reasons. Nathan had never been one for confrontation, and the past 2 months had been a masterclass in avoiding difficult conversations and pretending everything was fine when it clearly wasn't. "You okay?" he whispered, his breath warm against my ear as the string quartet began their prelude. The musicians were the same ones I had booked, playing the same pieces I had selected for my processional. Victoria had even kept my color scheme of blush pink and gold, though she had added her own touches with the excessive crystal chandeliers hanging from the ceremony arch. I nodded, not trusting my voice to remain steady. The truth was, I was far from okay. I was sitting at my sister's wedding wearing a dress I had originally picked out to wear to my own rehearsal dinner, watching her marry her fiancé Brandon in a ceremony that was supposed to be mine. The deposit I had paid 18 months ago, the one that had taken me 6 months to save from my salary at the marketing firm downtown, had somehow transferred to Victoria's name without my knowledge or consent. When I had called Aspen Ridge 3 months ago to confirm the final details for my September wedding, the coordinator had sounded confused. "I'm sorry, Miss Hamilton," she had said, her voice carefully professional, "but our records show that the Hamilton wedding for September 15th is under Victoria Hamilton's name. The deposit was transferred to her account in July." That phone call had been the beginning of what I was starting to think of as the unraveling. The first loose thread that, when pulled, would eventually bring down everything I thought I knew about my family. But sitting there in that third row, listening to the gentle murmur of conversation around me and watching my sister prepare to walk down the aisle in the wedding dress she had somehow managed to order in my exact size, I had no idea how deep the deception went. My mother Patricia sat in the front row wearing her favorite Chanel suit, the navy blue one she reserved for the most important occasions. Her silver hair was perfectly styled, not a strand out of place despite the mountain breeze that was causing most of the other guests to periodically smooth their hair. She had mastered the art of looking effortlessly elegant in any situation, a skill that had served her well in her role as the wife of one of Denver's most successful developers and the chair of multiple nonprofit boards. My father Richard stood beside her in his custom-tailored charcoal suit, checking his watch with the same impatient gesture I had watched him make thousands of times throughout my childhood. He was a man who valued efficiency above all else, who had built Hamilton Development Company from a small residential contractor into one of Colorado's premier luxury resort developers through sheer force of will and an almost supernatural ability to close deals. He had taught both Victoria and me that time was money, that every minute spent waiting was a minute that could have been spent building something profitable. The irony of that lesson wasn't lost on me as I sat there waiting for my sister's ceremony to begin, wondering how much time and money I had wasted on a wedding that was never going to happen. At least, not for me. Brandon Walsh, Victoria's fiancé, emerged from the side entrance of the ceremony space looking nervous but determined. He was a good match for Victoria in many ways, both of them sharing the same ambitious drive and social awareness that seemed to come naturally to people who had grown up in families like ours. Brandon worked in finance, managing investment portfolios for some of the wealthiest families in Colorado, and he understood the importance of appearances and connections in a way that Nathan, with his background in environmental science and his preference for hiking boots over dress shoes, never quite grasped. The music shifted to the processional march, and the guests rose to their feet as one. I felt Nathan's hand on my elbow, helping me stand, and I was grateful for the support. My legs felt unsteady, not from emotion but from the strange sensation of existing in a space that felt both familiar and completely foreign. I knew every detail of this venue because I had spent months planning for it, but seeing it decorated for someone else's wedding made it feel like I was looking at a photograph that had been subtly altered. Victoria's bridesmaids began their procession, each one wearing a different shade of pink that complemented the overall color scheme beautifully. I recognized most of them from Victoria's college sorority and her current social circle, women who worked in marketing or public relations or nonprofit development, the kinds of careers that provided good networking opportunities and flexible schedules for charity work and social events. They were all perfectly turned out, their hair styled in elegant updos and their makeup applied with professional precision. The last bridesmaid was my cousin Angela, my father's brother's daughter, who caught my eye as she passed our row and gave me a small, sympathetic smile. Angela and I had always been close, despite the 4-year age difference, and she was one of the few family members who had expressed any concern about the wedding situation. During the rehearsal dinner the night before, she had pulled me aside in the ladies' room and asked if I was really okay with everything that had happened. "It just seems so sudden," she had said, touching up her lipstick in the mirror while keeping her voice low enough that no one in the adjacent stalls could hear. Victoria's engagement was what, 4 months ago? And now she's having this elaborate wedding in September? It all feels very rushed. I had wanted to tell her everything, to explain about the stolen deposit and the venue that was rightfully mine, but something had held me back. Maybe it was the knowledge that anything I said to Angela would eventually make its way back to my parents, or maybe it was the growing suspicion that there was more to this story than I understood. Instead, I had just smiled and said that I was happy for Victoria, that Nathan and I were taking our time to plan something that would be perfect for us. The music swelled as Victoria appeared at the back of the ceremony space, and I had to admit that she looked absolutely stunning. Her dress was a masterpiece of silk and lace, with a cathedral-length train that caught the afternoon light beautifully. Her dark hair was styled in an elaborate chignon with small white flowers tucked throughout, and her makeup was flawless in the way that only comes from having a professional team spend 3 hours on preparation. She walked slowly down the aisle on my father's arm, smiling radiantly at the guests on both sides. When she passed our row, her eyes met mine for just a moment, and I saw something flicker across her face. Not guilt, exactly, but something close to it. A recognition that this moment was complicated in ways that went beyond the normal complexities of family dynamics. My father's expression as he walked Victoria down the aisle was one of pure pride and satisfaction. This was exactly the kind of event he lived for, the kind of social gathering that reinforced his position in Denver's business community and showcased his family's success. He had built his entire career on the principle that perception was reality, that the right connections and the right image could open doors that talent and hard work alone could never reach. As Victoria reached the altar and my father lifted her veil to kiss her cheek before handing her over to Brandon, I found myself thinking about my own relationship with him. We had always been close, or at least I had thought we were. He had taught me to drive in the parking lot behind his office on weekends, had helped me with my math homework throughout high school, and had been genuinely proud when I graduated from the University of Colorado with a degree in marketing and communications. But lately, I had started to notice subtle changes in the way he interacted with me. Conversations that used to flow easily now felt stilted and formal. Business discussions that he used to include me in were now happening behind closed doors. When I had asked him about possibly joining Hamilton Development Company after gaining a few more years of experience in marketing, he had been evasive, suggesting that I focus on building my career at other companies first. The officiant began the ceremony with the traditional opening about marriage being a sacred union, and I tried to focus on his words rather than the growing sense of unease that had been building in my chest for months. Nathan's hand found mine again, and I squeezed his fingers gratefully. Whatever was happening with my family, whatever strange dynamics were playing out around Victoria's sudden wedding and my displaced plans, I knew that Nathan was genuinely on my side. We had met 4 years ago at an environmental conservation fundraiser that my mother had dragged me to, one of those charity events where the ticket price was more about supporting the cause than actually enjoying the evening. Nathan had been there representing the consulting firm where he worked, trying to drum up business from some of the environmental nonprofits in attendance. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. We had bonded over our shared frustration with small talk and our mutual love of hiking, and by the end of the evening, he had asked me to join him for a weekend trip to Rocky Mountain National Park. Our relationship had developed slowly and naturally, built on shared interests and genuine compatibility rather than the kind of strategic social connections that seem to drive most relationships in my parents' circle. Nathan didn't come from money, but he was hardworking and intelligent and kind, and he made me laugh in a way that no one else ever had. When he proposed during that weekend at Aspen Ridge 3 years ago, I had said yes without hesitation. The planning process for our wedding had been a source of joy for me, a chance to combine my professional skills and event coordination with my personal vision for the most important day of my life. I had approached it with the same attention to detail that I brought to my work campaigns, creating spreadsheets and timelines and backup plans for every possible scenario. I had researched vendors for months, reading reviews and comparing prices and visiting venues throughout Colorado until I found the perfect combination of natural beauty and elegant amenities at Aspen Ridge. The deposit had been significant, nearly $3,000, but I had saved for it carefully over 6 months, setting aside money from every paycheck and picking up freelance projects on weekends to reach my goal. When I finally handed over the check to secure our September date, I had felt such a sense of accomplishment and excitement. I was making my dream wedding a reality through my own hard work and planning. That feeling of accomplishment had made the phone call 3 months ago even more devastating. Not just because I had lost my venue and my deposit, but because I couldn't understand how it had happened. I had never given Victoria access to my wedding planning documents or my vendor contacts. I had never discussed transferring the deposit or changing the date. One day I had a wedding planned for September 15th, and the next day I apparently didn't. When I had tried to get answers from Aspen Ridge, the coordinator had been apologetic but firm. The transfer had been processed according to their standard procedures, with all the proper documentation and signatures. They had copies of everything in their files, and as far as they were concerned, Victoria Hamilton was the rightful client for the September 15th wedding. I had asked to see the documentation, but they had explained that they could only share client information with the client herself. Since Victoria was now the primary contact for the wedding, I would need her permission to access any details about the booking. When I had approached Victoria about it, she had seemed genuinely surprised by my concerns. "Claire, I thought you knew," she had said, her voice full of what sounded like sincere confusion. "Mom said you had decided to postpone your wedding to Nathan, that you weren't ready for such a big commitment yet." When the venue became available, Brandon and I jumped at the chance. "We've been looking for months for something as beautiful as Aspen Ridge." The conversation had taken place in my parents' kitchen during Sunday dinner, with the rest of the family eating dessert in the dining room while Victoria and I talked in hushed tones by the granite island. I had felt like I was losing my mind, questioning my own memory of events and wondering if I had somehow misunderstood the situation. "I never said I wanted to postpone," I had told her, keeping my voice as calm as possible despite the panic rising in my chest. "Nathan and I are planning to get married in September. We've been planning it for over a year." Victoria had frowned, her expression showing what appeared to be genuine concern. "But Mom specifically told me that you had changed your mind. That you and Nathan were taking a break from wedding planning to focus on your careers. She said you would probably be relieved to have the pressure off for a while." That conversation had led to an even more confusing discussion with my mother, who had insisted that I had expressed doubts about the wedding timeline during a lunch we had shared several weeks earlier. According to her, I had mentioned feeling overwhelmed by the planning process and uncertain about whether September was the right timing for such a major commitment. I had no memory of that conversation, but my mother had been so specific in her recollection that I had started to wonder if I was somehow forgetting important details of my own life. The stress of wedding planning had been significant, and I had been working long hours at the marketing firm while trying to coordinate vendors and manage a guest list in my spare time. Was it possible that I had expressed doubts without realizing it? The officiant's voice brought me back to the present as he asked Brandon and Victoria to exchange their vows. Brandon went first, speaking about how Victoria had brought light and purpose into his life, how her intelligence and beauty and social grace had made him want to be a better man. His words were heartfelt and appropriate, exactly the kind of vows you would expect at a wedding like this. Victoria's vows were equally polished, touching on themes of partnership and shared dreams and building a life together that would honor both of their families and contribute to their community. She spoke beautifully, her voice clear and confident, and I could see tears in the eyes of several guests as she talked about the love and support that had brought her and Brandon to this moment. As I listened to my sister promise to love and honor her husband for the rest of her life, I found myself thinking about the vows Nathan and I had been writing for our own ceremony. We had decided to write our own rather than use traditional language, and I had been working on mine for weeks, trying to find words that would capture the depth of my feelings and the significance of the commitment we were making to each other. The words I had written seemed inadequate now, sitting in this borrowed ceremony space and watching someone else celebrate the beginning of married life. I wondered if Nathan and I would ever have the chance to say our vows to each other, or if this strange family situation would continue to complicate our plans indefinitely. The ceremony concluded with the traditional pronouncement of marriage and the kiss that sealed Victoria and Brandon's union as husband and wife. The guests erupted in applause and cheers, and the string quartet began playing the recessional music as the new couple walked back down the aisle together, their faces glowing with happiness and relief that everything had gone perfectly. As they passed our row, Victoria caught my eye again and smiled, a radiant expression of pure joy that was impossible to resent despite everything that had happened. Whatever complicated family dynamics had led to this moment, she was genuinely happy, and her happiness was infectious enough that I found myself smiling back and clapping along with everyone else. The guests began to file out of the ceremony space toward the cocktail reception area, and Nathan and I joined the slow-moving crowd. The afternoon was perfect for an outdoor celebration, with clear skies and a gentle breeze that carried the scent of pine trees and wildflowers down from the mountain slopes. The resort had set up several bars around the garden terrace, and servers in crisp white uniforms were already circulating with trays of champagne and appetizers. I accepted a glass of champagne from a passing server and took a sip, trying to shake off the melancholy that had settled over me during the ceremony. This was supposed to be a celebration, and despite the complicated circumstances, I wanted to be happy for Victoria and Brandon. They were starting their married life together, and they deserved to have this day be perfect for them. Nathan found us a spot near the edge of the terrace where we could see the mountains in the distance and watch the other guests without being in the center of the social swirl. He was good at reading my moods and understanding when I needed a few minutes to process difficult emotions before jumping into conversations with people who would inevitably ask about our own wedding plans. "You're handling this really well," he said quietly, his hand resting on the small of my back in a gesture of support. "I know this can't be easy for you." I leaned against him gratefully, drawing strength from his steady presence. "I keep thinking I should understand what happened, but nothing makes sense. The whole situation feels like I'm missing some crucial piece of information that would make everything clear." Nathan nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Maybe after things settle down from the wedding, we can sit down with your parents and get some real answers. There has to be an explanation for how the venue transfer happened without your knowledge." Before I could respond, my cousin Angela appeared at my elbow with her own glass of champagne and a concerned expression. "Hey, you two. How are you holding up? I know this whole situation has been really difficult." Angela had always been perceptive about family dynamics, probably because she had grown up watching the Hamilton family from the slightly removed perspective of being a niece rather than a daughter. She had seen patterns in relationships that sometimes escaped those of us who were too close to the situation to have perspective. "We're doing okay," I said, though I wasn't entirely sure that was true. "It's been a strange few months, but we're figuring things out." Angela glanced around to make sure no one was within earshot, then lowered her voice. "Claire, can I ask you something? Do you remember agreeing to let Victoria take over your wedding plans? Because I've been thinking about our conversation last Christmas, and you were so excited about September. You had already ordered your dress and booked the photographer. It doesn't make sense that you would just change your mind overnight." Her question hit me like a physical blow, not because it was unexpected but because it validated the doubts I had been carrying for months. Angela remembered my excitement about the wedding plans, which meant I hadn't imagined or forgotten my own feelings about getting married in September. "I don't remember agreeing to anything," I said carefully. "But everyone seems to think I did, so I've been wondering if maybe I said something that was misinterpreted." Angela frowned, her dark eyes serious. "That doesn't sound like you, Claire. You're one of the most organized people I know. If you had changed your mind about something as important as your wedding date, you would have made sure everyone understood exactly what was happening and why." Nathan shifted beside me, and I could tell he was processing Angela's words with the same mixture of relief and confusion that I was feeling. It was validating to have someone else question the official family narrative, but it also raised more questions about what had actually happened and why my mother and Victoria had such specific memories of conversations I couldn't recall. Before we could continue the conversation, my mother appeared beside our little group with her social smile firmly in place. Patricia Hamilton had perfected the art of gracious hostessing over decades of charity events and business gatherings, and she moved through crowds with the kind of effortless elegance that made everyone feel like they were the most important person in the room. "Claire, sweetheart, you look lovely," she said, air-kissing my cheek in the European style she had adopted after a trip to France several years earlier. "And Nathan, that suit is very handsome on you. I'm so glad you were both able to be here for Victoria's special day." The way she phrased it made it sound like we had been invited guests rather than family members, and I noticed Angela's eyebrows rise slightly at the formality of the greeting. My mother had never been particularly warm in her interactions with me, but she usually showed more familiarity than she would with acquaintances from her charity work. "Thank you for including us," Nathan replied politely. "The ceremony was beautiful." Victoria looked radiant. My mother beamed with pride. "She did, didn't she? Everything turned out exactly as we hoped. The weather cooperated perfectly, and the vendor team was absolutely professional. I think everyone will remember. This is one of the most elegant weddings of the season." There was something in the way she emphasized the word elegant that made me feel like she was making a point about the level of sophistication that Victoria had achieved with this celebration. It was the kind of subtle communication that my mother excelled at, the ability to convey approval or disapproval through tone and word choice rather than direct statements. "The venue is spectacular," Angela said diplomatically. "I can see why it's so popular for weddings. The mountain views are incredible." My mother nodded enthusiastically. "Aspen Ridge really is perfect for this kind of celebration. Victoria and Brandon were so fortunate that the date became available when it did. These places book up years in advance normally." The casual way she mentioned the date becoming available felt deliberate, like she was testing to see how I would react. I kept my expression neutral, but inside I was cataloging every word and inflection for later analysis. There were layers of meaning in this conversation that I was only beginning to understand. "Well, I should go check on the catering setup for dinner," my mother continued. "The reception coordinator wanted to go over the final timeline with me before the guests move inside. Claire, I hope you and Nathan are planning to stay for dancing. The band is supposed to be wonderful." After she walked away, the three of us stood in silence for a moment, processing the interaction. Finally, Angela spoke up, her voice carefully controlled. "Did that seem weird to anyone else? The way she talked about the date becoming available like it was just a coincidence?" Nathan and I exchanged a look, and I could see that he was thinking the same thing I was. My mother's comment had sounded less like an explanation and more like a cover story, the kind of carefully constructed narrative that she used in her nonprofit work when she needed to present complicated situations in the most favorable light possible. The cocktail hour continued around us as we tried to process this new information, but I found myself increasingly distracted by questions that had no clear answers. How exactly had the Aspen Ridge date become available? What documentation had been required to transfer my deposit to Victoria's account? And why did my mother seem so invested in making sure everyone understood that this was all a fortunate coincidence rather than something that had been deliberately orchestrated? As the sun began to set behind the mountains and the resort staff started directing guests toward the indoor reception space, I realized that Victoria's wedding was not going to be the end of this story. It was just the beginning of my understanding of how deep the deception in my family actually went, and how far some people were willing to go to maintain the perfect image at any cost. The morning after Victoria's wedding, I woke up in my Capitol Hill apartment with a headache that had nothing to do with the champagne I'd consumed at the reception. Nathan was already awake beside me, propped up against the headboard with his laptop balanced on his knees, scrolling through work emails with the kind of focused concentration that told me he was trying to avoid discussing the elephant in the room. The reception had been flawless, of course. Victoria and Brandon had danced their first dance to the same song I had planned to use, surrounded by 300 guests in the resort's grand ballroom with its soaring timber ceilings and crystal chandeliers. The dinner had been served on china that matched the pattern I had selected, and even the wedding cake had been a variation of the design I had sketched out during my initial planning meetings with the pastry chef. Watching my sister live out my wedding vision had been surreal in a way that I was still struggling to process. It wasn't just that she had taken my venue and my date. She had somehow replicated nearly every detail I had spent months planning. The centerpieces were different, more elaborate and expensive than what I had budgeted for, but the overall aesthetic was unmistakably based on the vision I had shared with vendors throughout the planning process. I pulled myself out of bed and padded to the kitchen, where I started the coffee maker and tried to organize my thoughts. The questions that had been nagging at me for months felt more urgent now, sharpened by the experience of watching my wedding unfold with someone else. As the bride, how had Victoria known about my specific vendor selections? How had she managed to book the same photographer, the same florist, even the same string quartet that I had secured with signed contracts? While the coffee brewed, I opened my laptop and navigated to the folder where I had been keeping all of my wedding planning documents. Every contract, every email exchange, every receipt and timeline and vendor contact sheet was organized in subfolders by category. It was the same system I used for managing marketing campaigns at work, and it had served me well throughout the planning process. I started with the Aspen Ridge contract, reading through the terms and conditions with the careful attention I should have paid months ago when I first signed it. The cancellation policy was clear: deposits were non-refundable unless the venue had to cancel due to circumstances beyond their control. Transfers to other clients were possible under specific conditions, but they required written authorization from the original client and a formal amendment to the contract. I scrolled through my email history, searching for any correspondence about transferring my booking to Victoria. There was nothing. No emails from Aspen Ridge requesting authorization, no documents I had signed, no record of any communication about changing the primary client information. According to my files, I had been in regular contact with the venue coordinator Margaret Sinclair about details for my September wedding right up until that phone call 3 months ago. The silence from Nathan told me he was processing the same questions I was. He had been involved in enough of the planning process to know that this situation made no sense from a logistical standpoint. Venues like Aspen Ridge didn't make mistakes about client information or accidentally transfer deposits between family members. Everything they did was documented and verified, especially for bookings as expensive as ours had been. I pulled up the photographer's contract next, studying the language about cancellations and rebookings. David Chen had been my first choice for wedding photography from the moment I saw his portfolio, with its perfect balance of candid emotion and elegant composition. His waiting list was typically booked out 18 months in advance, but I had managed to secure him for my September date by putting down a deposit immediately after our first consultation. When Victoria had announced that David would be photographing her wedding, I had assumed it was a coincidence. Denver's wedding photography scene was competitive but relatively small, and it made sense that we might have similar taste in vendors. But looking at his contract now, I noticed a clause I had overlooked before: in the event of a cancellation, the photographer retained the right to offer the date to other clients, but the original deposit would be credited toward future services rather than refunded. I opened a new browser tab and searched for David's website, looking for any evidence of how Victoria had managed to book him for the exact same date I had originally reserved. His online calendar showed availability several months out, but September 15th was marked as booked. There was no indication of how long it had been reserved or what had happened to the original booking. Nathan finally closed his laptop and joined me at the kitchen table, bringing 2 mugs of coffee and the concerned expression he wore whenever he was trying to figure out how to help me solve a problem that seemed to have no clear solution. "Find anything useful?" he asked, settling into the chair across from me and glancing at the documents spread across my laptop screen. I turned the computer so he could see the photographer's contract. "Look at this cancellation policy. If I had cancelled my booking with David, the deposit should have been credited to my account for future use. But according to his website, September 15th is still booked, which means either I never actually cancelled, or someone else did it without my knowledge." Nathan frowned as he read through the contract language. "Did you ever give Victoria access to your vendor information? Maybe she contacted David directly after you decided to postpone?" The question hit me wrong, not because Nathan was being unreasonable but because it highlighted the fundamental assumption everyone seemed to be making about this situation. Everyone, including Nathan, believed that I had made a conscious decision to postpone my wedding. Even my own fiancé was operating under the assumption that I had somehow forgotten or misremembered my own choices. "Nathan, I need you to really hear what I'm saying," I said, keeping my voice calm despite the frustration building in my chest. "I never decided to postpone anything. I never gave Victoria access to my vendor information. I never had a conversation with my mother about being overwhelmed or uncertain about our timeline. I have no memory of any of those things because they never happened." He set down his coffee mug and looked at me directly, his expression shifting from concern to something more serious. "Claire, what are you saying exactly? That someone forged your signature or impersonated you to cancel your vendors?" The question hung in the air between us, and I realized that was exactly what I was starting to think. The alternative explanations that everyone had been offering for months didn't hold up under scrutiny. Either I was experiencing some kind of memory loss that had caused me to forget major decisions about my own life, or someone had deliberately manipulated the situation to transfer my wedding plans to Victoria. I'm saying that something happened. Here that doesn't make sense, and I'm tired of everyone acting like I'm confused about my own intentions, I said. Look at the evidence, Nathan. Every single vendor I booked is now working Victoria's wedding. Every detail I planned, down to the specific flowers and music selections, showed up at her reception last night. That's not a coincidence. Nathan was quiet for a long moment, studying my face with the kind of careful attention he usually reserved for analyzing environmental data at work. He was a scientist by training, someone who believed in evidence and logical conclusions, and I could see him working through the implications of what I was suggesting. Okay, he said finally. Let's assume you're right, that someone deliberately interfered with your wedding plans. Who would have had access to your vendor information? And the authority to make changes to your bookings? I had been asking myself the same question for weeks, and the answer was uncomfortable but becoming increasingly clear. My mother helped me with some of the initial vendor research. She knows Margaret Sinclair personally from charity work, and she recommended David Chen because he had photographed several events for the Hamilton Foundation. She also introduced me to the florist and helped me negotiate some of the catering details. The words felt heavy as I spoke them, loaded with implications I wasn't ready to fully accept. My mother had been involved enough in my wedding planning to have access to vendor contacts and contract information. She also had the social connections and business experience to navigate the kinds of conversations that would be required to transfer bookings between clients. Nathan reached across the table and took my hand, his thumb tracing gentle circles across my knuckles. Claire, if that's what happened, if your mother somehow orchestrated this whole situation, then we need to figure out why. What would she gain from giving Victoria your wedding instead of just helping her plan her own? It was a good question, and one that pointed toward motivations I was only beginning to understand. My mother had always been focused on appearances and social positioning, but transferring my wedding to Victoria seemed extreme even for her. Unless there were factors I wasn't aware of, reasons why Victoria needed to be married quickly and expensively that went beyond normal family dynamics. I spent the rest of the morning going through every piece of wedding-related correspondence in my email, looking for clues I might have missed. What I found was a pattern of communication that suddenly stopped in July, right around the time Victoria had announced her engagement to Brandon. After that date, I had no responses to follow-up emails with vendors, no confirmations of timeline changes, no updates about menu selections or floral arrangements. At the time, I had attributed the radio silence to the busy summer season and assumed that vendors would get back to me as we got closer to the September date. Now I realized that the silence had a different explanation. The vendors had stopped responding to me because they were no longer working with me. Someone had informed them that Victoria Hamilton was now the primary client for the September 15th wedding. Nathan suggested that we drive out to Aspen Ridge to speak with Margaret Sinclair directly. It was a Saturday, but mountain resorts typically had coordinators on duty for weekend events, and we might be able to get answers that weren't available over the phone. I agreed, partly because I wanted to see the documentation Margaret had mentioned and partly because I needed to understand how the transfer had been processed. The drive up to Aspen Ridge took us through some of the most beautiful scenery in Colorado, with golden aspen trees lining the mountain highways and snow-capped peaks visible in the distance. Under normal circumstances, it would have been a romantic afternoon trip, the kind of spontaneous adventure that Nathan and I both enjoyed. But today the beautiful scenery felt like a mockery of the romantic vision I had once had for this place. Margaret Sinclair was indeed working that Saturday, overseeing the setup for an anniversary party that evening. She remembered me immediately and seemed genuinely happy to see me, though I detected a note of confusion in her greeting that suggested she wasn't entirely sure why I was there. Claire, how lovely to see you again. I hope you enjoyed Victoria's wedding yesterday. Everything went so smoothly, exactly as we planned. And congratulations on your engagement, she added, glancing at Nathan with a warm smile. I don't think we've met officially. I'm Margaret. Nathan introduced himself, and we exchanged pleasantries about the resort and the beautiful weather. Margaret seemed relaxed and friendly, showing no signs of discomfort about our unexpected visit. If she had been involved in anything questionable regarding my booking, she was either an excellent actress or genuinely unaware that anything improper had occurred. Margaret, I was hoping you could help me understand something about the booking transfer that happened with my wedding, I said, trying to keep my tone casual and non-accusatory. I'm having trouble remembering exactly how that process worked, and I wanted to make sure I understand what happened for my own records. Her expression shifted slightly, becoming more professional and cautious. Of course. As I mentioned when we spoke on the phone, the transfer was processed according to our standard procedures. We received the proper authorization and documentation to change the primary client information from your name to Victoria's. I nodded encouragingly. I'm sure everything was handled correctly. I was just wondering if I could see a copy of the authorization I signed, for my own files. I'm usually very organized about keeping track of important documents, but I seem to have misplaced my copy. Margaret hesitated, and I could see her weighing professional policies against customer service instincts. I'm afraid I can't share client documentation without proper authorization. The transfer files are considered confidential information that belongs to the current client, which would be Victoria. Nathan stepped in with the kind of reasonable, problem-solving tone that made him so effective in his consulting work. Would it be possible for Victoria to authorize you to share the documents with Claire? Since they're sisters, and Claire was originally involved in the planning process? That would certainly be possible, Margaret agreed. If Victoria provides written authorization, I'd be happy to share copies of the transfer documentation with Claire. We thanked Margaret for her time and headed back down the mountain, but I felt more frustrated than before. Getting answers was going to require Victoria's cooperation, and I wasn't sure how to approach that conversation without seeming accusatory or paranoid. My sister had just returned from her honeymoon planning and was probably still basking in the glow of her perfect wedding. Asking her to help me investigate whether our mother had manipulated the booking process seemed like a sure way to create family drama. On the drive home, Nathan and I discussed our options. We could approach Victoria directly and ask for her help in understanding what had happened. We could try to get answers from my parents, though previous conversations suggested they would maintain the story about my supposed decision to postpone. Or we could try to investigate independently, though our access to information was clearly limited. I was leaning toward the direct approach with Victoria when my phone rang with a call from an unknown Denver number. I almost let it go to voicemail. But something made me answer. Claire Hamilton? The voice was female, professional, and unfamiliar. Yes, this is Claire. Ms. Hamilton, this is Jennifer Walsh from Colorado Legal Aid. I'm calling because we received some documentation that might be relevant to you regarding property transfers and the Hamilton Family Trust. Do you have a few minutes to speak? I felt Nathan's eyes on me as I tried to process what the caller was saying. I'm sorry, I think you might have the wrong person. I don't know anything about property transfers or a family trust. According to the documents we received, you're listed as a beneficiary of the Hamilton Family Trust, established by your grandmother Rose Hamilton in 1995. The trust includes several properties, including a stake in the Aspen Ridge Resort where your family has been holding events. I'm calling because there are some irregularities in recent transfer documents that might affect your interests. The world seemed to tilt around me as I absorbed this information. My grandmother had died when I was in college, and I had been told that she had left small personal bequests to her grandchildren but that the bulk of her estate had gone to my parents to support their business ventures. I had never been told anything about a family trust or property holdings that included part of Aspen Ridge Resort. I think I need to hear more about this, I said, my voice sounding strange and distant to my own ears. When would be convenient for you to meet? Jennifer suggested Monday morning at her office downtown, and I agreed immediately. After I hung up, Nathan and I sat in the car in my apartment parking lot, trying to process what had just happened. Claire, if your grandmother left you an interest in Aspen Ridge Resort, that changes everything about this situation, Nathan said slowly. If your family has been keeping that information from you, and if someone has been making property transfers without your knowledge. He didn't need to finish the sentence. We both understood the implications. This wasn't just about a wedding venue anymore. It was about money, property, and legal rights that I had never known I possessed. And if my mother had manipulated my wedding booking as part of a larger scheme involving family assets, then the deception went much deeper than I had imagined. I spent Sunday in a state of anxious anticipation, researching Colorado trust law and trying to understand what rights I might have as a beneficiary. The more I learned, the more questions I had about my family's business dealings and the extent of my grandmother's estate. If Rose Hamilton had owned an interest in Aspen Ridge Resort, what other properties might be involved? And why had I never been informed about my inheritance? Nathan tried to keep me distracted with a hike in the foothills and dinner at our favorite restaurant, but I couldn't focus on anything except the upcoming meeting with Jennifer Walsh. I had the feeling that whatever I learned on Monday morning would fundamentally change my understanding of my family and my place within it. Monday morning arrived gray and drizzly, with the kind of persistent precipitation that made Denver's fall weather feel more depressing than usual. Jennifer Walsh's office was in a converted warehouse in the River North Art District, part of a nonprofit legal clinic that provided services to people who couldn't afford traditional representation. The building was filled with the kind of earnest energy that came from people trying to make a difference in the world through careful attention to paperwork and legal procedure. Jennifer herself was younger than I had expected, probably in her early 30s, with short blonde hair and the kind of intense focus that suggested she took her work very seriously. Her office was small but organized, with law books stacked neatly on shelves and case files arranged in precise piles on her desk. "Thank you for coming in, Ms. Hamilton," she said, gesturing for me to take a seat across from her desk. "I want to start by explaining how we came to have information about your situation. Last week, we received an anonymous package containing documents related to the Hamilton Family Trust and several property transfers that appeared to have irregularities." She opened a thick manila folder and spread several documents across the desk where I could see them. "These include copies of your grandmother's original trust documents, recent transfer authorizations, and what appear to be forged signatures on several legal forms. Someone wanted us to investigate whether these transfers were legitimate." I stared at the documents, recognizing my grandmother's spidery handwriting on some of the older papers and seeing my own name listed as a beneficiary in several places. But there were also newer documents with signatures that looked like mine, but felt wrong somehow, the same way the wedding vendor authorizations had felt wrong. "Who sent you these documents?" I asked. Jennifer shook her head. "The package was anonymous, but whoever sent it knew enough about trust law to identify the problematic elements and highlight them for our attention. They also included a note suggesting that you might not be aware of your rights as a beneficiary." She pointed to a document dated just 2 months ago, showing a transfer of trust assets that included my share of the Aspen Ridge Resort ownership to a holding company controlled by my parents. The signature at the bottom was supposed to be mine, but I had never seen the document before. "Ms. Hamilton, did you sign this transfer authorization?" I studied the signature carefully, comparing it to my own handwriting on other documents in my purse. The basic shape was similar, but the pressure and spacing were different in ways that suggested someone had been copying my signature rather than writing naturally. "No," I said firmly. "I've never seen this document before, and I definitely didn't sign it. I didn't even know I owned an interest in Aspen Ridge Resort until you called me on Saturday." Jennifer nodded grimly. "That's what we suspected. Based on the documentation we've reviewed, it appears that someone has been systematically transferring trust assets out of your name without your knowledge or consent. This is considered fraud under Colorado law, and it's something we can help you address." The next hour was a blur of legal explanations and procedural details. Jennifer explained that I had the right to challenge the fraudulent transfers and reclaim my inherited assets. She also mentioned that depending on the extent of the fraud, there might be criminal implications for whoever had forged my signature on the transfer documents. As I walked out of Jennifer's office with copies of the trust documents and a plan for beginning the legal process to reclaim my inheritance, I felt like I was seeing my family's behavior with completely new eyes. The wedding venue situation hadn't been about Victoria's sudden engagement or my mother's desire to give her younger daughter a perfect celebration. It had been about controlling assets that rightfully belonged to me, using my own wedding plans as cover for a much larger deception. The thought that my mother had manipulated my wedding booking as part of a scheme to steal my inheritance was almost too overwhelming to process. But as I sat in my car outside the legal clinic, reviewing the documents Jennifer had given me, I realized that the evidence was undeniable. Someone in my family had been systematically defrauding me for months, and they had used my trust and love against me to carry out their plan. By the time I got home, I had made a decision. I wasn't going to confront my family about what I had discovered. Instead, I was going to let them continue thinking they had gotten away with their scheme while I quietly worked with Jennifer to gather evidence and build a case. If they wanted to play games with forged signatures and stolen assets, then I would show them exactly what happened when they underestimated someone who had learned to fight back. The hardest part about discovering my family's betrayal wasn't the anger or the hurt. It was pretending that nothing had changed while I gathered evidence for what Jennifer Walsh had warned me would be a complex legal battle. For 2 weeks after my meeting at Colorado Legal Aid, I continued showing up to Sunday dinners at my parents' house, participating in normal family conversations, and acting like the confused daughter who couldn't quite remember her own wedding decisions. Nathan struggled with the deception more than I did. He kept suggesting that we should confront my parents directly, demand explanations, and give them a chance to make things right before involving lawyers and formal legal proceedings. His faith in the possibility of family reconciliation was touching, but it also revealed how fundamentally different our families were. Nathan's parents were divorced but civil, honest about their flaws, and genuinely committed to their children's well-being. The idea that parents might systematically defraud their own daughter was outside his experience. I spent my evenings researching property law and reviewing the documents Jennifer had provided, trying to understand the full scope of what my grandmother Rose had left me. The Hamilton Family Trust was more complex than I had realized, with assets that included not just the partial ownership of Aspen Ridge Resort but also commercial properties in downtown Denver, residential developments in several Colorado mountain towns, and investment accounts that had grown substantially over the past 28 years. According to the original trust documents, I was entitled to a third of all trust assets, with Victoria receiving another third and my parents serving as trustees until both daughters reached 30. I had turned 31 last spring, which meant I should have gained direct control over my portion of the inheritance months ago. Instead, someone had been forging my signature on transfer documents that moved my assets into accounts controlled entirely by my parents. The pattern of deception was methodical and sophisticated. Each forged document had been notarized by different notaries public throughout the Denver area, making it harder to trace the fraud to a single source. The signatures were skillful forgeries, close enough to my actual handwriting to pass casual inspection but different enough that a forensic analyst would be able to prove they were fake. Whoever had orchestrated this scheme had access to multiple examples of my signature and enough legal knowledge to understand exactly what documents would be required to transfer trust assets. Jennifer had recommended a forensic accountant who specialized in family trust disputes, and I spent a morning in his office going through bank records and investment statements that showed the movement of my inheritance over the past several months. The amounts involved were staggering. My grandmother's estate had been worth nearly $2 million when she died, and 28 years of careful investment had grown my portion to almost $800,000 before the transfers began. The money had been moved in stages, with smaller amounts transferred first to test whether anyone was monitoring the accounts. When those transfers went unnoticed, larger sums had followed. The final transfer, completed just 3 weeks ago, had moved the remaining balance of my inheritance into an account labeled Hamilton Development Special Projects, which appeared to be connected to my father's real estate business. Understanding the timeline helped explain why Victoria's wedding had happened so quickly. My parents had needed a cover story for why I was suddenly absent from family events and business discussions. By positioning me as someone who was taking a step back from major commitments, they had created space to complete the asset transfers without raising questions about why I wasn't participating in decisions about my own inheritance. The realization that my sister's entire wedding celebration had been funded with my stolen money was almost too much to process. Every detail I had admired despite myself, from the elaborate floral arrangements to the custom-designed cake, had been paid for with assets that rightfully belonged to me. Victoria's honeymoon to Europe, Brandon's new Rolex watch, even the down payment on their new house in Cherry Hills Village had all been financed through the systematic theft of my inheritance. I found myself studying my family members with new eyes during our Sunday dinners, looking for signs of guilt or awareness of what they had done. My father seemed more relaxed than he had in months, talking enthusiastically about new development projects and potential expansion opportunities for Hamilton development. My mother was planning a charity gala for December and discussing the need to rent additional space to accommodate the growing guest list. Victoria glowed with newlywed happiness, showing off photos from her honeymoon and describing their plans for renovating their new house. She talked about wanting to host Christmas dinner this year, about hiring a decorator to create the perfect entertaining spaces, about all the ways she was going to contribute to Denver's social scene as a married woman from an established family. Listening to these conversations while knowing that Victoria's new lifestyle was being funded with my stolen money required a level of self-control I hadn't known I possessed. But I was learning to channel my anger into something more useful, careful planning for the moment when I would reveal everything I had discovered. Jennifer had warned me that family trust disputes often became public, especially when they involved allegations of fraud and forgery. The Hamilton name was well known in Denver business circles, and my father's development company was involved in several high-profile projects around the city. Once I filed formal challenges to the asset transfers, there would be no way to keep the situation private. The thought of public exposure should have worried me, but instead I found it oddly comforting. For months, I had been the one carrying the burden of confusion and doubt, wondering if I was losing my memory or misunderstanding my own decisions. Soon, my family would be the ones answering uncomfortable questions and trying to explain inconsistencies in their stories. I decided to start with a test, a small confrontation that would help me gauge how my parents planned to handle challenges to their narrative. During one of our Sunday dinners, I casually mentioned that I had been thinking about my grandmother Rose and wondering what had happened to some of her jewelry that I remembered from my childhood. I was particularly thinking about that emerald necklace she used to wear to formal events, I said, watching my mother's reaction carefully. She always said she was going to leave it to her granddaughters someday. I was wondering if it might be in a safe deposit box somewhere, or if maybe it was part of her estate that I should know about. The silence that followed my question was brief but telling. My father continued cutting his steak as if he hadn't heard me, but my mother's expression shifted in a way that confirmed my suspicions about how much they both knew. "Oh, sweetheart, your grandmother didn't really have much in the way of valuable jewelry," my mother said with the kind of dismissive tone she used when she wanted to end a conversation. Most of what she owned was costume pieces or family heirlooms with more sentimental than monetary value. Your father and I handled all of the estate details after she passed, and there wasn't anything significant to distribute. Victoria looked up from her phone with mild interest. I remember that emerald necklace. It was gorgeous. I always wondered what happened to it too. My mother's smile became strained. I'm sure if there had been anything valuable, we would have made sure you girls received it. But your grandmother was never one for expensive jewelry. She preferred to invest her money in more practical things. The lie was so smooth and confident that I almost admired the skill required to deliver it. But I had seen photographs of my grandmother wearing the emerald necklace at charity events throughout the 1980s and 1990s, and Jennifer had found insurance records showing that it had been appraised at over $50,000 just a few years before Rose's death. The necklace definitely existed, and it was definitely valuable, which meant my mother was deliberately misleading me about my grandmother's estate. Nathan squeezed my hand under the table, a gesture of support that helped me maintain my composure. We had planned this conversation carefully, and his job was to keep me grounded if I became too emotional to think clearly. But instead of anger, I felt a strange sense of clarity. My mother's willingness to lie so casually about something as specific as my grandmother's jewelry confirmed that the financial fraud was just part of a larger pattern of deception. After dinner, I excused myself to use the bathroom and took the opportunity to look around my parents' house with fresh perspective. The recent renovations I had noticed over the past few months suddenly made more sense. The new kitchen with its custom cabinetry and marble countertops, the professionally landscaped backyard with its outdoor entertaining area, the art collection that had expanded to include several expensive pieces from local galleries. My parents had been spending money at a level that seemed inconsistent with the normal income from my father's development business, especially given the challenging real estate market over the past few years. But if they had access to nearly $800,000 in trust assets that they were treating as their own money, then the increased spending made perfect sense. I found myself standing in my father's home office, looking at the photographs on his desk that showed groundbreaking ceremonies and ribbon cuttings for various Hamilton development projects. There was also a newer photo that I hadn't seen before, showing my parents with Margaret Sinclair at what appeared to be a business meeting or social event. They were all smiling and holding champagne glasses, and the photo had the feel of a celebration rather than a routine vendor relationship. The sight of that photograph triggered a memory I hadn't fully processed before. When I had first toured Aspen Ridge Resort with Margaret 18 months ago, she had mentioned that my family was already connected to the property through some kind of business relationship. At the time, I had assumed she was referring to the Hamilton Foundation's use of the resort for charity events, but now I wondered if the connection was more direct. If my grandmother's trust owned a significant stake in Aspen Ridge Resort, then my parents might have been involved in management decisions about the property for years. They would have had access to booking information, vendor relationships, and operational details that could have made it easy to manipulate my wedding arrangements. Margaret might not have realized that the transfer of my booking was fraudulent if it had been presented to her as a routine family business decision. The more I thought about the logistics of what had been done to me, the more I realized how carefully it had been planned. This wasn't a sudden decision made in response to Victoria's surprise engagement. It was a systematic scheme that had probably been in development for months, designed to coincide with my 30th birthday and the trust provisions that should have given me direct control over my inheritance. By the time Nathan and I left my parents' house that evening, I had made a decision about how to proceed. Jennifer had suggested that I could pursue the fraud case quietly, working through lawyers and forensic accountants to prove what had happened and recover my assets. But the photograph on my father's desk and the casual lies about my grandmother's jewelry had convinced me that a quiet resolution wasn't going to be enough. My family had used my love and trust against me, manipulating my emotions and my relationships to cover up their theft. They had turned my sister's wedding into a performance designed to humiliate me and justify their actions. If they wanted to play games with public image and social positioning, then I would show them exactly what happened when someone who understood marketing and public relations decided to fight back. I spent the next week developing a strategy. That would accomplish several goals simultaneously. I wanted to recover my stolen assets, expose the fraud that had been committed against me, and make sure that my family faced appropriate consequences for their actions. But I also wanted to do it in a way that would maximize the impact and minimize their ability to control the narrative. Jennifer had introduced me to a private investigator who specialized in financial crimes, and I hired him to document the full scope of my family's deception. Within days, he had uncovered evidence that the fraud went beyond just my inheritance. My parents had been using trust assets as collateral for business loans, mixing family money with company finances in ways that violated their fiduciary duties as trustees. The private investigator also discovered that my parents had been planning to sell their stake in Aspen Ridge Resort to a hospitality investment group based in California. The sale was scheduled to close in January, just a few months away, and it would have permanently transferred my inherited interest in the property to buyers who had no idea they were purchasing stolen assets. That discovery accelerated my timeline for taking action. If I waited much longer to challenge the fraudulent transfers, my parents might complete the sale and use the proceeds to hide their theft behind layers of complex financial transactions. I needed to move quickly to protect my interests and preserve evidence before it could be destroyed or transferred beyond recovery. I also learned that the hospitality investment group interested in buying Aspen Ridge was part of a larger company called Mountain Vista Holdings, which owned luxury resorts throughout the western United States. They had been expanding their Colorado portfolio over the past few years, acquiring properties that offered both natural beauty and upscale amenities for wealthy clients seeking exclusive vacation experiences. The idea that formed in my mind was ambitious enough to make my palms sweat, but it also felt like the perfect way to turn my family's scheme against them. If my parents were planning to sell my inherited stake in Aspen Ridge to Mountain Vista Holdings, then maybe I could find a way to approach the investment group directly. Not as the victim of fraud, but as someone with inside knowledge about a property they wanted to acquire. Jennifer was skeptical when I outlined my plan during our meeting the following Tuesday. She pointed out that attempting to negotiate directly with potential buyers while simultaneously pursuing fraud charges against my family could complicate the legal case and potentially expose me to accusations of improper conduct. But the more I thought about it, the more convinced I became that a direct approach was the right strategy. My parents had underestimated me throughout this entire process, treating me like someone who would never figure out what they had done, or would be too intimidated to challenge them even if I did. They had built their scheme on assumptions about my passivity and my willingness to accept their explanations without question. I had spent months proving them wrong about my ability to investigate and understand their deception. Now I wanted to prove them wrong about my ability to outmaneuver them in the kind of high-stakes business negotiations that my father had always claimed were beyond my capabilities. The first step was researching Mountain Vista Holdings and identifying the decision-makers who would be involved in the Aspen Ridge acquisition. I spent hours on their website and corporate filings, learning about their expansion strategy and the types of properties they preferred to purchase. I also reached out to contacts in Denver's hospitality industry, gathering intelligence about the company's reputation and negotiating style. What I discovered was that Mountain Vista Holdings was led by a woman named Diana Morrison, a former hotel executive who had built the company through a combination of strategic acquisitions and careful attention to operational details. She had a reputation for being tough but fair in negotiations, and several articles about her business philosophy emphasized her commitment to transparency and ethical dealing in all her transactions. The more I learned about Diana Morrison, the more convinced I became that she would be interested in knowing the truth about the Aspen Ridge ownership situation. If Mountain Vista Holdings was planning to spend millions of dollars acquiring the resort, they would want to be certain that the sellers actually had legitimate authority to transfer ownership. Discovering that part of the property had been obtained through fraud would be exactly the kind of information that could derail the entire deal. I decided to approach Diana Morrison directly, not as the victim of my family's scheme but as someone with valuable information about a property her company was considering for acquisition. I would offer to share what I knew about the true ownership structure of Aspen Ridge Resort in exchange for the opportunity to present an alternative proposal for how the transaction might be structured. The letter I wrote to Diana Morrison was perhaps the most important business communication I had ever composed. I needed to convey enough information to capture her attention without revealing details that could compromise my legal case against my family. I also needed to position myself as a serious business partner rather than someone seeking sympathy or assistance. In the end, I kept the letter brief and professional, explaining that I had information about irregularities in the ownership structure of Aspen Ridge Resort that could affect Mountain Vista Holdings' planned acquisition. I requested a confidential meeting to discuss the situation and explore alternative approaches that might better serve all parties involved. I sent the letter on a Thursday afternoon and received a response within 24 hours. Diana Morrison's assistant called to schedule a meeting for the following Tuesday at Mountain Vista Holdings' Denver office. The speed of the response suggested that my letter had indeed captured their attention, and I spent the weekend preparing for what I knew would be the most important business meeting of my life. Nathan helped me practice my presentation, playing the role of skeptical investor while I refined my arguments and anticipated potential objections. He was still worried about the risks I was taking, but he could see how energized I had become by the prospect of fighting back against my family's manipulation. On Tuesday morning, I dressed in my most professional outfit and took a taxi to the downtown office building where Mountain Vista Holdings had their regional headquarters. As I rode the elevator to the 23rd floor, I felt a mixture of nervousness and excitement that reminded me of the feeling I used to get before major presentations at my marketing job. Diana Morrison turned out to be exactly the kind of executive I had expected based on my research: impeccably dressed, sharply intelligent, and completely focused on understanding the business implications of everything I was telling her. She listened without interruption as I explained the fraud that had been committed against me and the questionable legitimacy of my parents' authority to sell their stake in Aspen Ridge Resort. When I finished my presentation, she asked exactly the kind of questions I had hoped she would ask. How could I prove that the asset transfers had been fraudulent? What documentation existed to support my claims about the true ownership structure? What legal proceedings were already underway to challenge my family's actions? I answered each question carefully, providing enough detail to demonstrate the strength of my case without revealing information that could compromise Jennifer's legal strategy. By the end of our meeting, Diana Morrison had agreed to delay Mountain Vista Holdings' acquisition of Aspen Ridge Resort until the ownership dispute could be resolved through the courts. But more importantly, she had also expressed interest in discussing a different kind of deal entirely. Instead of buying Aspen Ridge from my parents, Mountain Vista Holdings might be interested in partnering with me directly, using my inherited stake in the property as the foundation for a larger acquisition strategy that could include other Colorado resort properties. As I left that meeting, I realized that my family's attempt to steal my inheritance had inadvertently given me access to opportunities one never could have imagined. Instead of being the victim of their scheme, I was positioned to become a major player in Colorado's hospitality industry, with the resources and connections to build something much bigger than anything my parents had ever attempted. The thought of what I was about to unleash made me smile as I walked back to my car. My family had taught me that money and power were the only things that really mattered in their world. Soon, they were going to discover exactly what happened when someone who understood those lessons decided to use them in ways they had never anticipated. 3 days after my meeting with Diana Morrison, everything changed at once. I was at my desk at the marketing firm when Jennifer Walsh called with news that would accelerate every plan I had been carefully developing over the past month. The forensic analysis of the forged signatures had been completed, and the results were even more damning than we had hoped. "Claire, we have enough evidence to file criminal charges," Jennifer said, her voice carrying the kind of professional excitement that came from building an airtight case. "The signature analysis shows clear evidence of systematic forgery across multiple documents. More importantly, the private investigator found bank records showing that your parents deposited checks from the fraudulent asset transfers directly into accounts used for personal expenses." I closed my office door and lowered my voice, aware that my colleagues were working just outside. "What kind of personal expenses?" "Everything from Victoria's wedding costs to luxury purchases for their house. We can trace your inheritance. Money directly to payments for catering, photography, floral arrangements, even Victoria's honeymoon expenses. The paper trail is so clear that any jury would be able to follow it." The confirmation that my stolen money had indeed funded Victoria's entire wedding celebration should have made me angrier, but instead I felt a cold sense of satisfaction. My family had been so confident in their scheme that they hadn't bothered to hide the evidence. They had treated my inheritance like their personal checking account, never imagining that I would have the resources or determination to trace where the money had gone. Jennifer continued with details about the legal process, explaining that we now had enough evidence to seek both criminal prosecution and civil recovery of my assets. She recommended that we file the criminal complaint first, which would freeze my parents' ability to transfer or hide any remaining assets while the investigation proceeded. "There's something else you should know," she added. "The anonymous source who originally sent us the trust documents contacted our office again. They're offering to provide additional evidence about other financial irregularities involving your family's business dealings." The mysterious source had been bothering me for weeks. Someone with inside knowledge of my family's finances had deliberately exposed their fraud, but I couldn't figure out who would have both access to the documents and motivation to help me. The timing suggested it was someone who had learned about the scheme recently, possibly as a result of Victoria's wedding or the planned sale of Aspen Ridge Resort. I spent the rest of the workday in a state of focused intensity, finalizing the presentation I planned to deliver to my family while coordinating with Jennifer about the timing of the criminal complaint. Everything had to happen in the right sequence to maximize the impact and minimize their opportunity to destroy evidence or transfer assets beyond recovery. Diana Morrison had agreed to attend a meeting at Aspen Ridge Resort on Friday afternoon, ostensibly to tour the property as part of Mountain Vista Holdings' due diligence process. What my parents didn't know was that I would be there as well, armed with complete documentation of their fraud and a recording device that would capture their reactions when I revealed everything I had discovered. The plan was ambitious and risky, but it felt like the only way to ensure that my family faced appropriate consequences for what they had done. I wasn't interested in a quiet legal settlement that would allow them to maintain their public image while privately acknowledging their wrongdoing. I wanted them to experience the same kind of public humiliation and loss of control that they had inflicted on me. Thursday evening, I drove up to Aspen Ridge Resort and checked into a room for the night, using the excuse that I wanted to spend some time in the mountains before winter set in. Margaret Sinclair seemed genuinely pleased to see me, and we had a pleasant conversation about upcoming events at the resort and her plans for expanding their wedding and conference business. I didn't mention that I knew about my inherited ownership stake in the property, or that I was aware of the pending sale to Mountain Vista Holdings. Instead, I played the role of a satisfied former client who was considering the resort for a future event, gathering information about their operations and financial performance that would be useful in my presentation to Diana Morrison. What I learned during that conversation was that Aspen Ridge Resort was more profitable than I had realized, with consistently high occupancy rates and a waiting list for prime wedding dates that extended more than 2 years into the future. The property was also strategically positioned for expansion, with adjacent land parcels that could be developed for additional guest accommodations or recreational facilities. Margaret mentioned that the current ownership group had been discussing various growth opportunities, but that recent changes in the partnership structure had complicated their ability to make major investment decisions. She didn't elaborate on what those changes entailed, but I suspected she was referring to the fraudulent transfer of my inherited stake to my parents. That evening, I sat on the balcony of my resort room overlooking the mountains and rehearsed the confrontation that would take place the following afternoon. I had memorized every detail of the evidence Jennifer had assembled, from the forensic analysis of the forged signatures to the bank records showing how my inheritance money had been spent. I was ready to answer any question my parents might ask and to counter any explanation they might offer for their actions. Nathan had wanted to be there for moral support, but I had convinced him that this was something I needed to do alone. The conversation would determine not just the resolution of the fraud case, but the future of my relationship with my family. Whatever happened during that meeting would be the final chapter of my life as Richard and Patricia Hamilton's daughter. Friday morning dawned clear and cold, with fresh snow visible on the higher peaks surrounding the resort. I spent the morning hiking on the property trails, using the physical activity to manage my nervousness and maintain the mental clarity I would need for the afternoon's confrontation. By noon, I felt calm and focused, ready to execute the plan I had been developing for weeks. Diana Morrison arrived at Aspen Ridge promptly at 2 o'clock, accompanied by 2 associates from Mountain Vista Holdings and a local attorney who specialized in hospitality acquisitions. I met them in the resort lobby and introduced myself as someone with information relevant to their potential acquisition of the property. My parents arrived 30 minutes later, dressed in their most professional attire and clearly expecting a routine business meeting with prospective buyers. My father carried a leather portfolio containing what I assumed were marketing materials about Aspen Ridge Resort and Hamilton Development Company's other properties. My mother wore her favorite Chanel suit and the kind of confident smile she reserved for important social and business occasions. Their expressions when they saw me sitting with Diana Morrison's group were worth the months of careful planning I had invested in this moment. My father's confident stride faltered, and my mother's professional smile became strained in a way that suggested she was rapidly trying to calculate what my presence might mean for their carefully orchestrated sale. Margaret Sinclair had reserved the resort's executive conference room for our meeting, a beautifully appointed space with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the mountains and a polished oak table large enough to accommodate all the participants. I had deliberately positioned myself across from where my parents would sit, ensuring that I would be able to see their faces clearly when I revealed what I knew about their fraud. Diana Morrison took charge of the meeting with the kind of executive presence that reminded me why Mountain Vista Holdings had been so successful in acquiring premium properties throughout the West. She began by outlining her company's interest in Aspen Ridge Resort and their preliminary assessment of the property's value and growth potential. Based on our initial review, she said, consulting notes on her tablet. Aspen Ridge appears to be exactly the kind of property that fits our acquisition criteria. The location is spectacular, the facilities are well maintained, and the financial performance has been consistently strong over the past several years. My father nodded enthusiastically, launching into a prepared presentation about the resort's unique features and competitive advantages. He talked about the property's history, its reputation among Denver's social elite, and Hamilton Development Company's vision for expanding the hospitality offerings through strategic partnerships with established resort operators. I listened to his presentation with a mixture of admiration and disgust. My father was genuinely talented at sales and marketing, able to present complex business propositions in ways that made them seem both logical and compelling. Under different circumstances, I might have been proud to watch him negotiate a major deal with such skill and confidence. But knowing that the entire transaction was based on assets he had stolen from me made every word feel like another layer of betrayal. He was selling my inherited stake in Aspen Ridge Resort as if it belonged to him, using his reputation and business connections to legitimize what was essentially a criminal enterprise. When my father finished his presentation, Diana Morrison turned to me with the kind of polite interest that suggested she was ready to hear whatever information I had promised to share. The moment I had been planning for weeks had finally arrived. "Thank you, Mr. Hamilton. That was very informative," I said, my voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through my system. "Before we proceed with discussing the terms of any potential sale, I think everyone should be aware of some irregularities in the ownership structure of Aspen Ridge Resort that could affect the legitimacy of this transaction." The silence that followed my statement was profound. My parents stared at me with expressions that shifted rapidly from confusion to alarm to something approaching panic. Diana Morrison and her associates leaned forward with the kind of focused attention that came from recognizing that a routine business meeting had suddenly become much more complicated. I opened the folder I had prepared and began distributing copies of the most important documents Jennifer had assembled. The original trust papers showing my inherited stake in Aspen Ridge Resort. The forged transfer authorizations that had moved my assets into my parents' control. The bank records showing how my inheritance money had been spent on Victoria's wedding and other personal expenses. "As you can see from these documents," I continued, maintaining the same professional tone I used for marketing presentations, "approximately 33% of Aspen Ridge Resort is owned through the Hamilton Family Trust, with myself as the primary beneficiary. However, recent transfers of trust assets appear to have been accomplished through systematic forgery of my signature on legal documents." My mother found her voice first, though it came out higher and more strained than her usual composed tone. "Claire, what are you talking about? These documents don't mean anything. You signed everything willingly after we discussed the trust restructuring earlier this year." The lie was so automatic and confident that I almost admired her ability to maintain the fiction even when confronted with forensic evidence of fraud. But I had anticipated exactly this response and was ready with my counter-argument. "Mom, I've never seen most of these documents before this week, and I certainly never signed them," I replied, pulling out additional papers from my folder. "This is a forensic analysis of the signatures in question, conducted by a certified handwriting expert. As you can see, the analysis concludes that the signatures were traced from legitimate examples of my handwriting rather than written naturally." Diana Morrison accepted a copy of the forensic report and studied it with the kind of careful attention that suggested she understood the legal implications of what I was revealing. Her associates were taking notes and exchanging meaningful glances that indicated they were reassessing everything they thought they knew about the Aspen Ridge acquisition. My father tried to regain control of the situation with the kind of authoritative bluster that had probably served him well in previous business negotiations. "This is ridiculous, Claire. You're obviously upset about something, but this is not the time or place to air family disagreements. We can discuss whatever concerns you have privately, after our guests have had a chance to complete their evaluation of the property." But Diana Morrison was too experienced a business executive to be dismissed so easily. "Actually, Mr. Hamilton, if there are questions about the ownership structure of Aspen Ridge Resort, we need to address them immediately. Mountain Vista Holdings cannot proceed with any acquisition until we're certain that all parties have legitimate authority to transfer ownership." She turned to me with the kind of direct focus that indicated she was taking my allegations seriously. "Ms. Hamilton, what you're describing sounds like a complex legal situation. Have you reported these alleged forgeries to law enforcement?" "The criminal complaint will be filed Monday morning," I said, watching my parents' faces as the full implications of my statement registered. "The FBI's white-collar crime unit will be investigating the systematic forgery of trust documents and the theft of approximately $800,000 in inherited assets." The word FBI hit my parents like a physical blow. My mother actually gasped, and my father's face went pale in a way that made him look older and more fragile than I had ever seen him. For the first time in my life, I was watching my parents realize that they were not in control of a situation, that their careful planning and social connections could not protect them from the consequences of their actions. Diana Morrison stood up from the table with the kind of decisive movement that indicated the meeting was effectively over. Given what Ms. Hamilton has shared with us today, Mountain Vista Holdings will need to postpone any further discussions about acquiring Aspen Ridge Resort until these ownership questions are resolved through the appropriate legal channels. She gathered her materials efficiently while her associates followed her lead. Ms. Hamilton, she said, addressing me directly, I'd like to schedule a follow-up meeting next week to discuss the situation further. Depending on how the legal proceedings develop, there might be opportunities for Mountain Vista Holdings to work with you directly rather than through the current ownership structure. After Diana Morrison and her team left the conference room, I found myself alone with my parents for the first time since I had discovered their fraud. The silence stretched between us, heavy with accusations and justifications that no one seemed ready to voice. Finally, my father spoke, his voice carrying a note of pleading that I had never heard from him before. Claire, you don't understand what you're doing. The family business, our reputation, everything we've built over 30 years could be destroyed by these accusations. Everything you built was stolen from me, I replied, my voice calm despite the emotion building in my chest. My wedding, my inheritance, my trust in my own family. You took all of it to fund Victoria's perfect life and maintain your social status. My mother tried a different approach, reaching across the table as if to take my hand. Sweetheart, we can work this out. Families have disagreements about money all the time, but we don't need to involve lawyers and criminal investigators. We can find a solution that works for everyone. I pulled my hand away before she could touch it. The solution that works for everyone is returning what you stole and facing the consequences of your actions. I spent months thinking I was losing my mind, questioning my own memory about my wedding plans and my grandmother's estate. You let me believe there was something wrong with me rather than admit what you had done. The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, with my parents cycling through denial, bargaining, and attempts at emotional manipulation. They promised to return my inheritance if I would drop the criminal complaint. They suggested that we could restructure the trust in a way that would give me greater control while preserving their business interests. They even hinted that they could arrange for me to have a wedding at Aspen Ridge that would be even more elaborate than Victoria's celebration. But none of their offers addressed the fundamental issue that had driven me to this confrontation. They had violated my trust in the most profound way possible, using my love for them as a weapon to facilitate their theft. No amount of money or promises could repair the damage they had done to our relationship. When I finally stood up to leave the conference room, my father made one last desperate attempt to maintain control. Claire, think about what you're doing to your sister. Victoria had nothing to do with the trust issues, but she'll be destroyed by the scandal if this becomes public. Do you really want to ruin her marriage and her future over a financial disagreement? The mention of Victoria stopped me at the door, not because I felt guilty about the consequences she might face, but because it reminded me of something I had been planning to reveal. I turned back to face my parents with a smile that felt strange on my face. Actually, Victoria won't be affected by the scandal nearly as much as you think, I said. You see, I've decided to take a different approach to resolving the situation. Instead of just recovering my stolen inheritance, I'm going to use it as the foundation for something much bigger. I paused, enjoying the confusion on their faces as they tried to understand what I meant. On Monday, in addition to filing criminal charges against you, I'll be announcing my partnership with Mountain Vista Holdings to acquire the entire Alpine Vista Resort Group. That's the chain that owns 5 luxury properties throughout Colorado, including Aspen Ridge. The shock on my parents' faces was everything I had hoped it would be. They had stolen $800,000 from me, thinking it would fund their comfortable retirement and Victoria's privileged lifestyle. Instead, their theft had given me the connections and motivation to build something that would dwarf anything Hamilton Development Company had ever accomplished. You see, I continued, Diana Morrison was very interested in my proposal to use my inherited stake in Aspen Ridge as collateral for a much larger acquisition. With the right financing and management structure, those 5 resorts could be the foundation for expanding throughout the western United States. Mountain Vista Holdings gets an experienced local partner, and I get the resources to build a hospitality empire. I let that information sink in before delivering the final blow. Of course, once I own the entire chain, I'll have to make some staffing changes. The Hamilton Foundation will no longer be welcome to hold events at any of our properties, and Hamilton Development Company will be permanently banned from our vendor lists. I'm sure you understand that I can't do business with people who have demonstrated such a casual attitude toward fraud and theft. The last thing I saw as I left the conference room was my father slumping back in his chair with the expression of someone who had just realized that his entire world was about to collapse. My mother was staring at the documents scattered across the table, perhaps finally understanding that their carefully constructed scheme had not just failed, but had inadvertently given me the tools to destroy everything they had spent decades building. As I walked through the resort lobby toward the parking lot, I felt lighter than I had in months. The confrontation I had been dreading had actually been liberating, a chance to finally speak the truth about what my family had done and to reveal the consequences that were coming for their actions. My phone buzzed with a text message from Nathan asking how the meeting had gone. I replied with a single word, perfect. By Monday morning, the whole world would know exactly what the Hamilton family had done to their own daughter, and exactly what happened when they underestimated someone who had learned to fight back with their own weapons. The drive back to Denver took me through some of the most beautiful mountain scenery in Colorado, but I barely noticed the landscape. Instead, I was thinking about the phone calls I would make over the weekend, the press releases that would be distributed Monday morning, and the look on Victoria's face when she realized that her perfect wedding had been funded with stolen money that was about to make her sister one of the most powerful hospitality executives in the western United States. Justice, I was learning, was even sweeter when it came with a side of irony that your enemies never saw coming. 6 months after that confrontation at Aspen Ridge Resort, I stood in the executive boardroom of Mountain Vista Holdings, looking out at the Denver skyline through floor-to-ceiling windows that reflected my new reality back at me. The woman in the reflection wore a tailored navy suit that cost more than my old monthly salary, carried herself with the confidence that came from controlling a multi-million-dollar hospitality empire, and bore only a passing resemblance to the confused bride-to-be who had once sat in a guest chair at her own sister's wedding. The criminal case against my parents had concluded the previous month with plea agreements that included full restitution of my stolen inheritance plus penalties and interest. Richard Hamilton had been sentenced to 18 months in federal prison for wire fraud and conspiracy, while Patricia had received 2 years of supervised probation and 500 hours of community service. The Hamilton Foundation had been dissolved, and Hamilton Development Company had filed for bankruptcy after losing their major contracts and facing civil lawsuits from investors who discovered the extent of the financial irregularities. Victoria's marriage to Brandon had survived the scandal, though barely. She had filed for divorce when she learned that her entire wedding and honeymoon had been financed with my stolen money, but had ultimately decided to stay with him after. He agreed to enter couples counseling and completely restructure their finances. They had sold the house in Cherry Hills Village and moved to a modest apartment in Capitol Hill, where Victoria was working as a marketing coordinator for a nonprofit while Brandon rebuilt his financial planning practice with a focus on middle-class families rather than wealthy clients. The transformation of my relationship with Victoria had been perhaps the most surprising aspect of the entire experience. In the weeks following the criminal charges, she had reached out to me through Nathan, asking if we could meet for coffee to discuss what had happened. I had agreed reluctantly, expecting either accusations or attempts at manipulation, but instead found myself sitting across from a sister I barely recognized. Victoria had lost weight and looked older, but there was something in her eyes that I had never seen before. It took me most of our conversation to realize what it was, genuine remorse mixed with something that looked like relief. She had spent months feeling guilty about her sudden wedding and the way our parents had excluded me from family events, but she had convinced herself that she was imagining problems that didn't actually exist. I knew something was wrong, she had told me during that coffee meeting, her voice barely above a whisper. When Mom said you had decided to postpone your wedding, it didn't sound like you at all. But when I asked questions, they made me feel like I was being paranoid or jealous. They said you were going through a difficult phase and that I should focus on my own happiness instead of worrying about problems that weren't my responsibility. She had apologized for not trusting her instincts and for accepting explanations that she knew didn't make sense. She had also offered to testify against our parents if it would help with the criminal case, though that had turned out to be unnecessary once the forensic evidence became available. The sister I had lunch with every few weeks now was different. From the one who had walked down the aisle in my stolen wedding, Victoria had developed a sense of independence and self-awareness that she had never possessed while living under our parents' influence. She was building a life based on her own values rather than their expectations, and for the first time in our adult relationship, we were able to have conversations that felt genuine rather than performative. Nathan and I had postponed our own wedding indefinitely while we navigated the legal proceedings and my new business responsibilities, but we had also grown closer throughout the process. He had watched me transform from someone who questioned her own memory and judgment into someone who could hold her own in boardroom negotiations with experienced executives, and his respect for my strength had deepened our relationship in ways that surprised both of us. We had moved in together during the spring, choosing a loft apartment in downtown Denver that reflected our shared preference for urban living and outdoor recreation. Nathan had been promoted to senior consultant at his environmental firm, and his work on sustainable development projects complemented my own focus on environmentally responsible hospitality management. The partnership with Mountain Vista Holdings had exceeded even Diana Morrison's optimistic projections. Within 4 months of our initial agreement, we had successfully acquired not just the Alpine Vista Resort Group but also 3 additional properties in Utah and Wyoming that expanded our portfolio to 8 luxury resorts throughout the Mountain West. The acquisition had been financed through a combination of my inherited assets, investment from Mountain Vista Holdings, and a syndicated loan from a consortium of banks that specialized in hospitality development. My role as Regional Director of Operations for the Mountain West Division had given me responsibility for overseeing the daily management of all 8 properties, coordinating marketing strategies across the portfolio, and identifying opportunities for expansion or improvement. It was challenging work that required me to travel frequently and make decisions that affected hundreds of employees and thousands of guests, but it was also exactly the kind of career I had always dreamed of having. The success of our acquisition strategy had attracted attention from hospitality industry publications and business journals throughout the region. I had been profiled in Colorado Business Magazine as one of Denver's rising executives under 40, and Mountain Vista Holdings had been recognized by the American Hotel and Lodging Association for our innovative approach to sustainable luxury hospitality. But the recognition that meant the most to me came from the employees and communities where our resorts operated. We had implemented programs that provided college scholarships for children of resort employees, supported local environmental conservation projects, and created partnerships with regional nonprofits that offered event space and catering services at cost for charitable fundraisers. The scholarship program had been particularly close to my heart because it addressed something I had learned during my research into my family's financial fraud. My parents had been using Hamilton Foundation resources to provide educational opportunities, primarily for children from families that were already wealthy and well-connected, rather than focusing on students who genuinely needed financial assistance to attend college. Our resort scholarship program worked differently, targeting first-generation college students from working families and providing not just tuition assistance but also mentoring, internship opportunities, and job placement support. In our first year, we had awarded scholarships to 32 students from communities throughout Colorado, Utah, and Wyoming, and we were planning to double that number in the coming year. I had also established a separate foundation focused on supporting women who were rebuilding their lives after experiencing financial fraud or domestic abuse. The foundation provided emergency assistance, legal support, and business development resources for women who needed help achieving economic independence. It was funded through a portion of my settlement from my parents' criminal case, and it operated with the same attention to transparency and accountability that I had learned to value through my own experience with family financial manipulation. One of the foundation's first major initiatives had been partnering with Colorado Legal Aid to provide pro bono legal services for women facing complex family financial disputes. Jennifer Walsh had become the program's legal director, and she had already helped dozens of women recover stolen assets and protect themselves from further financial abuse. The irony that my parents' theft had ultimately enabled me to help other women in similar situations was not lost on me. Their attempt to steal my inheritance and control my future had inadvertently given me the resources and motivation to build something much larger than anything they had ever accomplished. Every scholarship we awarded and every woman we helped represented a small victory over the kind of thinking that had led my parents to believe they had the right to manipulate my life for their own benefit. The morning I stood in that boardroom overlooking Denver was the day we were announcing our latest acquisition, a historic resort in Jackson Hole, Wyoming, that we planned to renovate and reopen as the flagship property for our expanding portfolio. The Jackson Hole Resort had been closed for renovations for 2 years, and its previous owners had been unable to secure the financing needed to complete the project. Our acquisition would preserve the property's historical character while adding modern amenities and environmental sustainability features that would make it a model for responsible luxury hospitality. The project would create nearly 200 permanent jobs in the Jackson Hole area and generate millions of dollars in economic activity for the region. Diana Morrison had flown in from Mountain Vista Holdings headquarters in California to participate in the announcement, and we were joined by the mayor of Jackson, representatives from the Wyoming Tourism Board, and several environmental groups that had endorsed our sustainable development approach. The press conference was scheduled for noon, and I had spent the morning reviewing my remarks and coordinating with our public relations team about media interviews that would follow the announcement. As I prepared for what would be the largest press conference of my career, I found myself thinking about the phone call I had received from my father 2 weeks earlier. It had been his first attempt to contact me since his release from federal prison, and I had debated whether to take the call at all. Richard Hamilton sounded older and more uncertain than I had ever heard him, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had lost everything he had spent decades building. He had called to congratulate me on the success of my business ventures, which he had been following through news coverage and industry publications. "I want you to know that I'm proud of what you've accomplished," he had said, the words sounding strange coming from someone who had once dismissed my career ambitions as unrealistic. "I know I have no right to feel proud, given what I did to you, but I want you to understand that your success means something to me." He had not asked for forgiveness or suggested that we try to rebuild our relationship. Instead, he had simply acknowledged that his actions had been wrong and that he understood why I could never trust him again. He had also mentioned that he was working with a financial counselor to understand how his decisions had affected not just me but also Victoria and the dozens of employees who had lost their jobs when Hamilton Development Company collapsed. I had listened to his entire speech without interrupting, and when he finished, I had thanked him for calling but made it clear that I was not ready for any kind of ongoing relationship with him. The conversation had lasted less than 10 minutes, but it had provided a sense of closure that I hadn't realized I needed. My mother had never attempted to contact me directly, though Victoria had mentioned that Patricia was struggling with depression and anxiety since the criminal case concluded. She had moved to a small apartment in a suburb north of Denver and was working part-time for a family friend who owned a small accounting firm. The woman who had once orchestrated charity galas for hundreds of guests was now processing invoices and managing client files for a business with fewer than 20 employees. I felt no satisfaction in learning about my mother's reduced circumstances, but I also felt no inclination to reach out to her or attempt any kind of reconciliation. She had made deliberate choices about how to treat me, and the consequences of those choices were hers to bear. I had spent enough energy trying to understand and forgive my family's behavior, and I was more interested in focusing on the future I was building than on repairing relationships that had been fundamentally damaged by their actions. The press conference went exactly as we had planned, with positive coverage from regional newspapers and trade publications that emphasized both the economic impact of our acquisition and our commitment to environmental responsibility. Diana Morrison and I fielded questions about our expansion strategy, our financing approach, and our plans for the Jackson Hole property with the kind of professional competence that reflected how much we had both learned about working together over the past year. After the press conference concluded and the media representatives had departed, Diana and I sat in my office reviewing the coverage and discussing our plans for the next phase of expansion. Mountain Vista Holdings was considering opportunities in Montana and Idaho that could extend our portfolio to 10 or 12 properties within the next 18 months. "You know," Diana said, looking out at the mountains visible from my office window, "when I first got your letter about the Aspen Ridge situation, I thought I was dealing with a family dispute that might complicate a routine acquisition. I had no idea I was meeting someone who would become one of the most effective partners I've ever worked with." Her comment reminded me of how much had changed in such a relatively short period of time. A year ago, I had been planning a wedding that would never happen, struggling to understand why my family seemed to be excluding me from their lives, and questioning my own memory about decisions I thought I had made. Now I was running a multi-million-dollar business portfolio, employing hundreds of people, and building something that would have a lasting positive impact on communities throughout the Mountain West. The transformation hadn't been easy or linear. There had been months of legal proceedings, difficult conversations with family members, and steep learning curves as I adapted to my new responsibilities in the hospitality industry. But every challenge had also been an opportunity to prove to myself that I was stronger and more capable than my family had ever given me credit for. That evening, Nathan and I celebrated the Jackson Hole announcement with dinner at our favorite restaurant in downtown Denver, a small place that specialized in locally sourced ingredients and had become our go-to spot for marking important occasions. We sat at our usual table by the window, where we could watch people walking along the 16th Street Mall while we talked about our work and our plans for the weekend. "I have something I want to discuss with you," Nathan said after we had ordered our entrees, his tone carrying the kind of nervous excitement that suggested he had been planning this conversation for a while. I looked at him with curiosity, wondering if he was going to tell me about a new project at his environmental consulting firm or perhaps suggest a weekend trip to one of our resorts for some much-needed relaxation time. Instead, he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small velvet box that I recognized immediately, though it took me a moment to understand why he was showing it to me. It was the engagement ring he had given me 4 years ago, the one I had returned to him when our original wedding plans fell apart and everything in my life became too complicated to think about marriage. Claire, I know we decided to postpone our wedding indefinitely while you were dealing with your family situation and building your new career, he said, setting the ring box on the table between us. But I've been watching you grow into this incredible businesswoman and leader, and I don't want to wait any longer to marry you. He opened the box to reveal the ring I had worn and loved for 3 years, the simple solitaire diamond that had represented our commitment to building a life together based on shared values and genuine partnership rather than family expectations or social conventions. I want to marry the woman you've become, not the woman you were when we first got engaged, he continued. I want to marry someone who knows exactly who she is and what she wants, someone who has the strength to fight for what's right even when it means standing up to her own family. I looked at the ring sparkling in the restaurant's candlelight and felt overwhelmed by how different this moment was from our original engagement. When Nathan had first proposed at Aspen Ridge Resort 3 years ago, I had said yes because I loved him and because marriage seemed like the natural next step in our relationship. But I had also been someone who defined herself largely through her family relationships and her desire to meet other people's expectations. The woman sitting in this restaurant was fundamentally different from the one who had accepted his first proposal. I had learned to trust my own judgment, to fight for my own interests, and to build something meaningful independent of anyone else's approval or support. I had also learned that real partnership meant choosing to be with someone not because you needed them to complete you, but because you wanted to share the life you were already building with someone whose values and goals complemented your own. Yes, I said, reaching across the table to take his hand. But this time, we're planning our own wedding, at our own venue, with our own money, and nobody else gets a vote about any of the decisions. Nathan laughed as he slipped the ring back onto my finger, where it felt both familiar and completely new. I was hoping you'd say that. I already have some ideas about venues, if you're interested in hearing them. As long as it's not Aspen Ridge Resort, I said, admiring the way the diamond caught the light. I own that place now, and I don't want people to think I'm just showing off. We spent the rest of dinner talking about wedding plans that reflected who we had become rather than who we had been. We wanted something small and intimate, focused on celebrating our commitment with the people who had supported us through the difficult times rather than creating a social event designed to impress business associates or family members. We ultimately decided to get married at the Jackson Hole Resort after its renovation was complete, partly because the mountain setting would be beautiful and partly because it would represent the life we were building together through our respective careers in environmental consulting and sustainable hospitality management. The guest list would include fewer than 50 people, close friends, supportive colleagues, Nathan's parents and siblings, and Victoria if she wanted to attend. My parents would not be invited, not out of spite but because their presence would change the entire dynamic of the celebration in ways that would be uncomfortable for everyone involved. Victoria had continued to rebuild her relationship with me slowly and carefully, respecting the boundaries I had established while demonstrating through her actions that she was committed to being the kind of sister I deserved. When I told her about Nathan's proposal and our wedding plans, she had been genuinely happy for us and had offered to help with any planning details that would be useful. I know I don't have the right to ask, she had said during one of our regular lunch meetings. But I would love to be there if you think it would be appropriate. I promise I won't make it about me or create any drama. I just want to see you happy. I had assured her that she would definitely be invited, and we had talked about the possibility of her playing some small role in the ceremony if she was interested. The conversation had reminded me of how much our relationship had improved once we were able to interact as adults rather than as daughters competing for parental approval. The wedding planning process was completely different from my previous experience, partly because Nathan and I were financing everything ourselves and partly because we had clear priorities about what mattered to us. Instead of spending months agonizing over vendor selection and design details, we focused on creating an experience that would reflect our values and celebrate our partnership with the people who had supported us. We hired a photographer whose work we admired for its natural, unposed style rather than the formal portraiture that would have impressed my mother. We chose a caterer who specialized in locally sourced, sustainable cuisine rather than the elaborate presentations that would have looked impressive in social media posts. We selected music that we actually enjoyed listening to rather than songs that would appeal to guests from multiple generations. Most importantly, we wrote our own vows that reflected what we had learned about love and partnership through the challenges we had faced together. My vows focused on gratitude for Nathan's support during the most difficult period of my life and my commitment to building a future based on honesty, mutual respect, and shared goals rather than family expectations or social pressures. The wedding took place on a September afternoon exactly 2 years after Victoria's celebration at Aspen Ridge Resort, though the anniversary was coincidental rather than deliberate. The Jackson Hole Resort had been reopened for 6 months by then, and it had already earned recognition as one of the premier sustainable luxury destinations in the Mountain West. Our ceremony took place on a terrace overlooking the Teton Range, with the early fall aspen trees providing a golden backdrop that was even more beautiful than anything we could have designed. The guest list included colleagues from both of our companies, college friends who had remained close throughout the years, and family members who had demonstrated their support for our relationship through their actions rather than just their words. Diana Morrison served as my matron of honor, a role that reflected both our business partnership and the friendship that had developed between us over the past 2 years. Jennifer Walsh was also in the wedding party, representing the legal and advocacy work that had become such an important part of my life. Victoria attended with Brandon, and she gave a brief speech during the reception that acknowledged the difficult history between our families while celebrating the relationship Nathan and I had built together. Her words were carefully chosen and genuinely heartfelt, and they marked a significant step forward in our ongoing process of rebuilding trust between us. The reception was held in the resort's main dining room, which we had decorated with simple floral arrangements featuring local wildflowers and candles that created a warm, intimate atmosphere. Instead of a traditional wedding cake, we served a selection of desserts made by the resort's pastry chef using ingredients from regional farms and producers. The evening concluded with dancing to music provided by a local bluegrass band, and Nathan and I spent our first dance talking quietly about how perfect the day had felt and how grateful we were to have reached this point in our lives. Looking around the room at the people who had chosen to celebrate with us, I felt a deep sense of satisfaction about the life we were building together. Our honeymoon was a working trip to several Mountain Vista Holdings properties in California and Oregon, where we combined romantic dinners and scenic hiking with meetings about potential expansion opportunities and sustainable development initiatives. It was exactly the kind of hybrid business and pleasure travel that reflected our shared interests and career goals. When we returned to Denver, I found a letter waiting in my office mail that had been forwarded from Colorado Legal Aid. It was from a woman in Wyoming who had read about our resort acquisition and the scholarship program we had established for employees' children. She was writing to thank me for creating opportunities for young people in rural communities and to share her own story of rebuilding her life after her husband had stolen their family's savings and disappeared. Her letter reminded me of why the work we were doing mattered beyond just business success or personal satisfaction. Every scholarship we awarded and every job we created represented an opportunity for someone to build a better future, just as my grandmother's trust had ultimately given me the resources to build something meaningful after my parents' betrayal. The foundation we had established to support women recovering from financial fraud had grown to serve clients throughout the Mountain West, and we were planning to expand our services to include business development support for women entrepreneurs who wanted to start their own companies. The program would provide not just financing but also mentoring, networking opportunities, and ongoing support for women who were building businesses in industries where they might face discrimination or lack of access to traditional funding sources. As I sat in my office that afternoon, reading through applications from the latest group of scholarship recipients and reviewing proposals for new resort development projects, I realized that my family's betrayal had ultimately led me to exactly where I was supposed to be. Not because their actions were justified or because everything had worked out for the best, but because I had chosen to use their betrayal as motivation to build something better than anything they had ever accomplished. The woman I had become was stronger, more independent, and more committed to using her success to help others than the woman I had been before my world fell apart. I had learned to trust my own judgment, to fight for what was right even when it was difficult, and to build relationships based on mutual respect rather than family obligation or social convenience. Standing at the window of my office, looking out at the Colorado mountains that had been the backdrop for both my family's betrayal and my own transformation, I felt grateful for the journey that had brought me to this moment. Not grateful for the pain or the lost relationships, but grateful for the strength I had discovered and the life I had built from the ashes of my family's deception. The future stretched ahead with possibilities I was only beginning to imagine: new resort properties to develop, more scholarships to award, additional women to help achieve economic independence, and a marriage built on the solid foundation of shared values and genuine partnership. I had learned that sometimes the most devastating betrayals could become the foundation for building something more meaningful than anything you had lost. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.